Cast your mind with me back to January 2015 and the horrific terrorist attacks in Paris that killed 12 people, including 8 journalists at the Charlie Hebdo magazine. You're probably familiar with the event, but it's worth recounting what happened. 2 Islamic jihadists named Saeed and Sharif Quashi stormed into an editorial meeting of the magazine staff. Their objective was to exact revenge against cartoonists employed there who, in their judgment, had blasphemously mocked the Prophet Muhammad. Dressed like soldiers and armed with assault rifles, the 2 men, brothers, killed the journalists, 2 police officers, a maintenance worker, and a visitor to the French satirical weekly newspaper. They injured 11 more before leading French counterterrorism forces on a 72-hour chase. Ultimately, they were cornered and killed during a shootout in northeast Paris. Meanwhile, another Islamic sympathizer, Ahmadi Coulibaly, who might or might not have coordinated his attacks with the Quashi brothers, took hostages at a kosher supermarket in Paris, where 4 more innocent Parisians died before he, too, was gunned down. The world reacted in shock and anger. Twitter and Facebook exploded with the Je suis Charlie hashtag and Instagram photos. The people of France marched in solidarity with the cartoonists. World leaders flocked to Paris in demonstrations of support. And the next issue of Charlie Hebdo was translated into more than 16 different languages, publishing more than 3 million copies, which sold out in short order. The assault on free speech and free expression proved unavailing. But in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo tragedy, many questions emerged about the failure of the French surveillance system. And that is what makes the tragic mass murder relevant to our discussion. You see, at least one of the Quashi brothers, Saeed, and possibly both of them, had taken weapons training in Yemen and interacted there with senior leaders of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a group often identified by its initials, AQAP. By some accounts, Saeed Quashi met with Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born sheikh who later died in an American drone attack. The younger brother, Sharif, in an interview while still cornered, claimed that al-Awlaki had financed the Paris attack. The Quashi brothers were not unknown to French anti-terrorism forces. Sharif had been arrested by French authorities in 2005 as he was about to leave to go fight in Iraq. He planned to travel to Iraq via Syria, a terror transit pipeline at the time, dominated by al-Qaeda in Iraq. He was convicted of supporting terrorism and sentenced to 3 years in prison for recruiting fighters to join the notorious leader of the al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. But Sharif didn't serve any time after the conviction. The judge ruled that his pre-trial detention had been enough. Nonetheless, Sharif's time in prison awaiting trial seems not only to have solidified his radicalization, but also to have connected him to people who were important in French militant circles. In pre-trial detention, Sharif met Jamal Beghal, who was being held for his role in an attempted attack on the U.S. Embassy in Paris back in 2001. Sharif and Beghal became friends, and in 2010, after Beghal was released, he and Sharif allegedly planned the jailbreak of another radical Islamist who was serving a life sentence for his involvement in the October 1995 bombing of the Musée d'Orsay train station in Paris. The attack had wounded 29 people. Likewise, Ahmadi Coulibaly, the Islamic sympathizer who is suspected of being complicit in the Quashi brothers' raid on the Charlie Hebdo newspaper, was said to have been on a U.S. terror watch list for quite a while before the attacks. There were also, it appears, records of his travel to Syria and a video he made declaring loyalty to the Islamic State. In retrospect, we know all this now, and we ask ourselves, what went wrong at the time? In this lecture, I want to use the Charlie Hebdo events to frame some questions about how the surveillance state can and should operate. First, I want to place the Hebdo attacks in the context of the challenges that surveillance agencies face. We ask them to be effective 100% of the time, but we also want them to act in a limited, privacy-respecting way. Second, I want to distinguish several types of surveillance, including physical surveillance, electronic surveillance, and a new form that we will call dataveillance. Finally, I want to begin a discussion of the possible uses and abuses of surveillance by looking at two polar cases: the hunt for Osama bin Laden and the routine scrutiny of air passengers by the Transportation Security Administration. After Charlie Hebdo, the French intelligence services face some of the same questions that recur after any terrorist incident. The most obvious is captured nicely in a Washington Post headline: "After Paris attacks, questions about intelligence failures." In short, people were asking, with that kind of background, how is it that the Kouachi brothers went unobserved? The failure is magnified, it seems, when we learn that at least one of them had been under surveillance until 6 months before the attack, and that he had actually been downgraded as a threat. Another question comes at the problem from the opposite direction. It asks why reams of intelligence did not thwart the Paris attacks. That's a New York Times headline. In other words, even with all that intelligence, we somehow missed the plot. Put colloquially, the first question asks, were we doing enough? The second asks, were we doing too much of the wrong thing? Or perhaps even more pointedly, does surveillance work at all? A third, much broader question is whether and how surveillance programs can be conducted in a way that fosters freedom and respects privacy and civil liberties while still being effective. The point is particularly poignant and brought home by the fact that Charlie Hebdo was a forum for expressing free speech. It would be a cruel irony indeed if the same steps that France took to protect the magazine wound up in the end chilling the magazine's freedom of expression. So the attack nicely captures the damned if you do and damned if you don't nature of the problem of security and surveillance. And so let's use it as a prism for introducing some concepts about surveillance and also as a way of sharpening the framework of our discussion. Any discussion of surveillance in the state must necessarily, I think, start with something of a shared understanding of what we're talking about. Everyone has an innate sense, of course, but it varies to a surprising degree from person to person. And at least as an initial matter, we should acknowledge that there are some who think that surveillance is improper and should be out of bounds altogether. They might think so for moral reasons or for practical reasons, but that point of view is neither insignificant nor unsupportable. To take but one example, back in 1929, Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson famously said, quote, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail," close quote. Saying that, Stimson shut down the Department of State's cryptanalysis office, making it impossible for the U.S. to decode the diplomatic cables of other nations. One historian later called this one of the most astonishing events in the history of military counterintelligence. Stimson was not a moron, nor was he a stranger to military conflict. He ably served 6 different presidents and had been Secretary of War under President Taft in the run-up to World War I. Rather, when he closed the cryptanalysis office, Stimson was expressing a view about espionage and secrecy that was, I think, more of a moral and a normative conclusion than a practical one. Note, Stimson did not say reading other people's mail doesn't work, and he didn't say reading other people's mail works, but it comes at a cost to liberty that isn't worth it. Those would be more utilitarian questions about effectiveness and cost. Rather, he simply said that surveillance was out of bounds among gentlemen. A decade later, Stimson's convictions did not survive the first contact of World War II. President Franklin Roosevelt recalled Stimson to service as Secretary of War after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And during World War II, the U.S. cipher bureaus and those of its allies intercepted communications all over the world. The British famously cracked the German Enigma code, and the Americans likewise cracked Japanese encryption and read their mail. As spying became a staple of the Cold War, cryptanalysis developed into a major strategy that almost all the major world powers employed. So today we face a similar defining moment. We worry again about whether our democratic institutions are sufficient. And we again ask the normative question of whether democracy and secrecy can coexist. Before continuing, let's briefly detour to distinguish the types of surveillance under discussion. Generally, surveillance comes in three basic forms. First, there's physical surveillance, dating from the times of Alexander the Great and earlier, up to the Stasi state in post-World War II East Germany and to today. This is the traditional form of scrutiny that has always been the province of spies and intruders. When I think of physical surveillance, the first image that comes to my mind is that of an eavesdropper, someone who in olden days quite literally lurked under the eaves of a house to see and hear what was happening within. An eavesdropper could, for example, hear a conversation, or if he looked in the window, become a peeping Tom and see the subject of his surveillance. One could, I imagine, even contemplate surveillance of smells, like, say, the scent of burning cannabis. For hundreds of years, this potentially wide-ranging form of physical surveillance was mostly the only sort of surveillance we knew. It morphed slightly over time as the nature of our physical environment changed, but there is little conceptual difference between the peeping Tom visually hiding under the eaves and the same peeping Tom using binoculars or a telescope from 200 yards away. Eventually, as the means of communication changed, so too did the means of interception. Shortly after the telegraph became a way to rapidly transmit messages around the globe, governments began exploring ways to intercept those messages. One of the notable espionage successes of the early 20th century was the British interception of the Zimmermann telegram. That telegram was a proposal from Germany to Mexico that Mexico should join World War I on its side if the U.S. entered with the Allies. The disclosure of the contents inflamed American opinion and was one of the underlying events that sent America into war in April 1917. American signals interception, another name for electronic surveillance, really came of age during the Cold War. Some of the surveillance seems, in retrospect, remarkable for its value. It's said, for example, that for years, the CIA ran a joint electronic surveillance operation with the Chinese in the western deserts of China to monitor Soviet missile launches. On the other hand, the Cold War also saw some signs of governmental abuse, the likes of which we've more recently come to be concerned about once again. In the mid-1970s, for example, the National Security Agency conducted 2 programs involving electronic interception that have since proven quite controversial. One of them, codenamed Shamrock, originated after the conclusion of the Second World War. It involved U.S. communications companies giving the NSA access to all of the international cable traffic passing through their company's facilities. The second program, known as Minaret, created a watch list of U.S. persons, including military deserters and those involved in civil disturbances and anti-war movements and demonstrations, whose communications were to be monitored. Included were such well-known anti-war activists as the singer Joan Baez, the actress Jane Fonda, and the pediatrician Dr. Benjamin Spock. To these traditional forms of surveillance, we must add a third, the collection and analysis of personally identifiable data and information about individuals. Data valence is an inevitable product of our increasing reliance on the internet and global communication systems. We leave an electronic trail almost everywhere we go. In a networked world, technological changes have made personally identifiable information pervasively available. And as the available storehouse of data has grown, so have governmental and commercial efforts to use this data for their own purposes. Commercial enterprises target ads at consumers and solicit new customers. Governments use the data to identify and target previously unknown terror suspects to find so-called clean skins. To further frame the discussion, let's take a look at two surveillance exercises: the hunt for Osama bin Laden and the operation of the Transportation Security Administration's no-fly list. These examples don't encompass the entire realm of the discussion, but I think they're meaningful starting points. The hunt for bin Laden used all three forms of surveillance, often in overlapping and mutually supportive ways. The entire story is still not fully declassified, but what we know of it from public reports suggests that the United States used almost every means available to track down the terrorist mastermind. The key to finding bin Laden appears to have come from identifying and then tracking one of his couriers. Initial information regarding the courier was collected from war on terror detainees at Guantanamo Bay. They gave American intelligence the courier's pseudonym, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwati. We were told that al-Kuwati was a protege of the Pakistani senior leader of al-Qaeda, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. It was not, however, until 2009 that we learned that the courier lived in Abbottabad, Pakistan. To track him, the CIA initially used sophisticated geolocation technology that helped pinpoint the courier's cell phone location. As reported by the Washington Post, quote, the National Security Agency also was able to penetrate guarded communications among al-Qaeda operatives by tracking calls from mobile phones identified by specific calling patterns. Analysts from the CIA pinpointed the geographic location of one of the phones and linked it to the compound in Abbottabad, where other evidence suggested bin Laden was hiding. Eventually, that allowed the CIA to determine the exact type of car that Kuwati drove. It was a white SUV. Using physical and electronic surveillance, the CIA began tracking the vehicle. One day, a satellite captured images of the SUV pulling into a large concrete compound in Abbottabad. Agents determined that al-Kuwati lived there and used aerial surveillance to keep watch. The residents of the compound were extremely cautious. They burned their trash instead of putting it out for collection. Why? Probably to frustrate a search of that trash that might have yielded DNA samples of the residents and thus been of use in identifying who lived there. In addition, the United States learned that the compound lacked a phone or an internet connection. Again, why? Almost certainly because the residents understood that phone and internet communications could be tracked, traced, and intercepted, the type of electronic surveillance for which the NSA has become quite renowned. All communications to the outside world ran through al-Kuwati and his brother, who came and went from the compound. Another man, who lived on the third floor, never left. He stayed inside the compound and underneath a canopy, frustrating overhead surveillance by satellite. In addition to satellites, the government flew an advanced stealth drone, the RQ-170, over Pakistan to eavesdrop on electronic transmissions from the compound. The observers called the hidden man the Pacer because he walked back and forth. Some analysts speculated that it was bin Laden. The CIA made any number of efforts to identify who the Pacer actually was. They tried to collect sewage from the compound to identify fecal matter and run a DNA analysis. But the sewage contained the effluents of other houses as well, and so they couldn't isolate a good sample. They also tried to trick the occupants. At one point, the CIA got a Pakistani doctor, Shakil Afridi, to pretend that he was conducting a vaccination program. Nurses tried to get inside the compound and vaccinate the children, which would have allowed them to get a DNA sample, but again, without success. For his pains in assisting the United States, the Pakistani government charged Afridi with treason and sentenced him to 22 years in prison. To get a closer look at the PACER, or even to grasp a better sense of activity at the compound, CIA spies moved into a house on the property next door. It has been reported that this surveillance operation cost so much money that the CIA had to ask for supplemental funding from Congress. Funding that, of course, it received. Surveillance also played a role in planning the eventual Navy SEAL assault on the compound. At one point, the military considered the possibility that bin Laden had an escape route from the building, perhaps a set of tunnels. But images provided by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is the agency that runs our overhead satellite imagery program, revealed that there was standing water in the vicinity. From this, analysts inferred that the building was on a floodplain and that the water table was just below the ground surface. If that were the case, then, of course, it was almost impossible for there to be tunnels. They would have been flooded. In short, during the hunt for bin Laden, the United States employed physical and electronic surveillance and sophisticated data analysis. The result, from an intelligence standpoint, was a success. Many Americans are not nearly so sanguine about another common form of post-9/11 surveillance: the Transportation Security Administration's airport screenings. By now, most Americans are pretty familiar with the long lines, thorough pat-downs, and X-ray inspections that are part of the process. We are quite tired of the ritual of taking off our shoes, removing our belts, taking our computers out of our bags, and passing through a magnetometer, or maybe a millimeter wave detection system, while our luggage proceeds separately via conveyor belt inspection only for bags, and luggage and clothing reassemble, if all goes well, somewhere at the other end of the process. But that physical screening comes at the back end of a process that begins much earlier, when you first make a reservation to fly. TSA security directives require airline passengers to present identification when they make a reservation. Later, if you're selected for secondary screening, you and your bags will be taken out of line for additional scrutiny. And why is it that we ask for a passenger's name along with gender and date of birth? The reason is because that data is used for a form of datavalence screening known as secure flight. Your name and date of birth are checked against a terrorist screening database, known by its initials, the TSDB, which contains a list of individuals identified as persons of interest by the U.S. intelligence community and who are considered potential threats to American national security. According to the TSA, Secure Flight conducts uniform pre-screenings of passenger information against federal government watch lists for all flights into, out of, and within the United States. Screenings include flights that overfly but don't land in the continental U.S. This was a key recommendation of the 9/11 Commission, the commission created by Congress and the President after the September 2001 attacks to identify security lapses and ways to strengthen U.S. defenses. The Secure Flight program has not, so far as is publicly known, ever actually spotted a terrorist. It has, however, identified a number of criminals attempting to travel, and of course, the physical screenings often uncover people who are trying to smuggle goods or guns onto an airplane. But there are some who consider the costs of such pervasive surveillance excessive in relation to its benefits. There are two ways one might legally challenge this kind of surveillance. Let's call them the wholesale way and the retail way. In 2006, a wholesale challenge to the program failed. In a case called Gilmore versus Gonzalez, a traveler named John Gilmore challenged the TSA's identification requirement. He asserted that he had a right to travel, and that his right to travel included the right to do so anonymously, without providing identification. The Federal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed, provisionally, that he had a right to travel. But it said that he didn't have a right to travel on an airplane. If he wanted to travel by air, the court said, Gilmore was consenting to the requirement that he provide identification before boarding the plane. If he didn't want to do that, he was free to travel by some other means, say by taking a train. As a result, in broad strokes, the court upheld the overall structure of the TSA screening program. The story doesn't end there, however. At what I'm calling the retail level, there are still some people who are not allowed to fly and who might have a reasonable argument that the government has made a mistake in listing them as security risks. After all, nobody can doubt that the government sometimes makes mistakes, can they? 10 U.S. citizens, including 4 military veterans, went years unable to fly to or from the United States, or even over American airspace, because they were on the government's top-secret no-fly list. Never told why they'd made the list, they didn't have much chance of getting off of it either. In June 2010, the American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit on behalf of a disabled Marine veteran named Ayman Latif, who was living in Egypt, and the 9 others, contending that their constitutional rights had been violated. Latif won the case. The court concluded that he did have a right to challenge his inclusion on the no-fly list and was entitled to a process by which he could seek to be removed from it. It didn't help the government's case that Latif had probably been put on the list by mistake and should have been removed long before his lawsuit came to court. And that brings us full circle to another set of concepts that we need to think about: the balance between transparency and effectiveness. As the Latif case makes abundantly clear, effective oversight of the surveillance state requires the surveillors to be at least somewhat transparent. Latif could not have gotten relief had he not enjoyed access to the courts, and if he had not been able to force the government to justify and explain itself. At the same time, it should be obvious from the bin Laden example that complete transparency would easily frustrate legitimate security objectives. Had the CIA been obliged to publicly report that it was operating a safe house in Abbottabad, without, I might add, the consent of the Pakistani government, or if the existence of that safe house were leaked to the press and made public, there can be little doubt that bin Laden would have been tipped off and disappeared again. The French faced many of the same questions in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo tragedy. The French public wanted to know if their intelligence services were doing enough, and if they were doing the right things. The public also wanted to know enough about what its government was doing to set a balance between effectiveness and accountability in the intelligence sector. In France, as in the United States and elsewhere around the world, that, I think, frames the tension quite well between transparency and secrecy.